In the summer of 1985, 12-year-old twins Dante and Deon Jackson vanished while playing near an old meat-packing plant in Cleveland. The police called them runaways. For 10 long years, that lie was the only story. Then, a demolition crew, tasked with tearing down the derelict building, unearthed a secret so horrifying it would rewrite a decade of silence. Before I begin, thank you for watching. Let me know in the comments, where are you watching from and what time is it there? It really means a lot to know you're here with us. We're in this together. Now, let me tell you what really happened. The summer of 1985 was a pressure cooker in Cleveland, and the industrial flats were at searing bottom. The air, thick with the ghosts of industry, tasted of rust and hot metal. For Dante and Deon Jackson, identical 12-year-old twins, it was a kingdom of concrete and possibility. They were a single soul in two bodies, their bond forged in the shared space of a cramped bedroom and the silent language only twins possess. Dante was the anchor, the thinker, his eyes holding a premature gravity. Deon was the wind, impulsive and quick to laugh, always pulling Dante toward the next adventure. Their older sister, Cynthia, 17 and caught in the orbit of her own teenage world, watched them like a worried hawk, their protector by birthright. Their world was circumscribed by the chain-link fences of forgotten factories and the cracked pavement of their working-class neighborhood. And at its heart loomed the Superior Meats Company plant, a hulking brick monster that perpetually sighed a foul, Swedish miasma into the humid air. It was a place of local legend, a dare waiting to be taken. The smell, a nauseating cocktail of old blood and chemical cleaners, was a physical presence, a warning. The kids in the neighborhood told stories of strange noises, of a building that seemed to breathe in the dark. One sweltering August afternoon, the air so heavy it felt like a wet blanket, Deon's adventurous spirit got the better of him. "I dare you," he said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, his eyes fixed on the plant's rust-streaked walls. "I dare you to touch the loading dock door." Dante hesitated, the familiar knot of caution tightening in his stomach. "Cynthia said to stay away from there. Says it ain't right." "Cynthia ain't here," Deon shot back, already jogging toward the fence. "We'll be quick. In and out. What's the worst that could happen?" It was the unofficial motto of their youth, a phrase that unlocked every forbidden door. Dante, unable to let his brother face a challenge alone, sighed and followed. They slipped through a gap in the fence, the overgrown weeds scratching at their bare legs. The closer they got, the more oppressive the plant became. The low, guttural hum of machinery vibrated through the soles of their sneakers. The smell was suffocating now, clinging to their clothes and hair. They reached the stained concrete of the loading dock. Deon, grinning triumphantly, slapped his palm against the corrugated steel door. The sound was a flat, dead thud in the oppressive silence. "See? Nothing," he said, puffing out his chest. But it wasn't nothing. From the shadows of the dock, a figure emerged. He was a man who seemed utterly out of place, his white shirt pristine against the grime, his gray hair neatly combed. He was old, but his posture was unervingly straight, and his eyes, a pale, washed-out blue, held a chilling stillness. It was Orville Blackwood, the owner, a man as much a myth as his factory. He didn't smile, not truly. The corners of his mouth lifted, but it was a gesture devoid of warmth, a mechanical twitch. "You boys have an interest in industry?" he asked, his voice surprisingly soft, cultured. Dante and Deon froze, a pair of startled deer. "No, sir," Dante mumbled, grabbing Deon's arm. "We were just leaving." "Nonsense," Blackwood said, taking a step closer. His eyes flickered between the two of them, a strange, calculating light dancing in their depths. "Identical. A perfect mirror. That's quite rare. A fascinating biological symmetry." He spoke as if he were admiring a piece of art, not two children. "I'm about to decommission some of the old equipment. A marvel of engineering from a bygone era. It's a shame to let it go without a final appreciation. Would you care to see it?" Deon's eyes lit up. An invitation inside the Forbidden Fortress? It was the ultimate prize. Dante felt a prickle of fear, a cold dread that defied the afternoon heat. The man's gaze was too intense, his language too strange. "I don't know," Dante started. "I could use your help." In fact, Blackwood continued smoothly, his eyes now on Deon, sensing the weak link. "There's a release valve on the old steam press that requires 2 people to turn at once. A small task. In exchange, I'll give you each $5 for your trouble. $10. To Deon, it sounded like a fortune. It was the price of a dozen comic books, of weeks' worth of soda and candy. His curiosity, now fueled by greed, eclipsed all caution. "We can do that," he said, nodding eagerly. Blackwood's lipless smile widened. "Excellent. Follow me." He turned and slid open a small service door they hadn't noticed before. A wave of cold, sterile air washed over them, a stark contrast to the humid heat outside. It carried the smell of bleach and something else, something raw and metallic. Dante looked at Deon, a silent plea in his eyes, but his brother was already captivated, enchanted by the promise of secrets and money. Deon took the first step across the threshold. Bound by his unspoken oath to never leave his brother's side, Dante had no choice but to follow. The heavy door groaned shut behind them, the sound echoing in the sudden darkness. The click of the lock was a final, metallic punctuation mark. They were plunged into a world of cold concrete and humming fluorescent lights. The vastness of the outside world, the shouts of other children, the distant rumble of traffic, it all vanished. There was only the low hum, the antiseptic chill, and the quiet, measured footsteps of Orville Blackwood leading them deeper into the heart of his monster. They were no longer in their kingdom. They were in his. And as the doors sealed them in, the hot summer sun continued to beat down on a city that had no idea 2 of its sons had just been swallowed whole. The first sign of trouble was the lengthening of the shadows. Cynthia Jackson, waiting on the front porch, felt it as a physical shift in the air. The humid grasp of the afternoon was giving way to the cooler breath of evening, and her brothers were still not home. It wasn't like them. Not really. They were adventurers. Yes, but they were also creatures of habit, their internal clocks tethered to the promise of dinner. She called their names until her throat was raw, her voice swallowed by the indifferent city sounds. Panic, cold and sharp, began to needle its way through her. By the time her parents' car pulled into the driveway, the panic had bloomed into a full-blown, suffocating terror. The precinct was a blur of beige walls and buzzing fluorescent lights that seemed to mock the family's frantic energy. They were met by a pair of detectives, one old and paunchy, the other younger, but already carrying the same air of weary cynicism. They listened to Cynthia's parents with a practiced patience that felt more like condescension. 12 years old, you said? Both of them? The older one, Detective Miller, asked, scribbling lazily in a small notepad. Probably just lost track of time. Boys that age, they get into things. Find a new spot to play, forget the world. They wouldn't do that, Cynthia interrupted, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and rage. Not for this long. They always check in. Always. Something is wrong. The younger detective, Harris, gave her a placating look. I'm sure they're fine, miss. We'll put the word out, have a patrol car swing by the usual spots. The quarry, the old rail yard. Odds of their hold up in some clubhouse, scared of the trouble they're in for being late. The narrative was being written for them, an easy, off-the-shelf explanation that required the least amount of effort. 2 black kids from the flats go missing? They must be runaways. Or troublemakers. The implication hung in the air, thick and unspoken. When Cynthia mentioned the Superior Meats plant, a place she'd always feared, Miller barely looked up from his notes. Private property, ma'am, he said, his tone final. We can't just go barging in without cause. Besides, that place has been locked up tight for years. The investigation, if it could be called that, was a tragedy of apathy. Patrol cars drove slowly past parks and abandoned lots. The detectives made a few phone calls, but there was no urgency, no sense that 2 young lives were hanging in the balance. The search parties, organized by Cynthia and her neighbors, were a testament to community spirit, but they combed the same barren fields and derelict buildings with growing despair. Orville Blackwood, when questioned briefly over the phone, reported that he'd been in his office all day and had seen nothing. His word, the word of a white business owner, was taken as gospel. For Cynthia, the days that followed were a waking nightmare. Her grief was a raw, open wound, but it was quickly poisoned by the bitter taste of injustice. She watched her parents crumble, their hope eroding with each passing hour, their grief turning inward, creating a chasm of silent blame in their small house. But Cynthia's grief turned outward. It sharpened into a diamond-hard rage. She was the one who printed the missing posters, her brother's smiling school pictures a cruel mockery of their fate. She was the one who walked the streets, showing their faces to strangers who offered empty platitudes or, worse, suspicious glares. One evening, about a week after the disappearance, Cynthia saw something that froze the blood in her veins. She was standing across the street from the Superior Meats plant, staring at its dark, imposing facade, when a car pulled out of the gated driveway. It was Orville Blackwood's sedan. It drove past her slowly, and for a moment, her eyes met his through the windshield. There was no recognition in his face, no flicker of emotion at all. He looked through her as if she were a ghost, his expression one of placid, untroubled calm. He was a man leaving his office after a day's work, a man without a single care in the world. The image of his serene face, his ordinary car disappearing down the street, became seared into her mind. It was the moment her suspicion hardened into a terrifying certainty. The world saw a concerned business owner. She saw a monster hiding in plain sight. The case went cold with sickening speed. The police officially classified Dante and Deon as runaways. The file was placed in a cabinet, a closed chapter in the city's vast book of unsolved sorrows. The posters she'd plastered on every telephone pole and storefront began to fade and peel, their hopeful smiles turning into water-stained grimaces. The world moved on, but Cynthia could not. She stood before the wall in her brother's empty bedroom, where their penciled height marks still climbed toward the ceiling. The detective's final words to her mother echoed in her ears. "We've done all we can. They'll turn up when they're ready." It was a lie, a comfortable story told to close a file. For the first time, Cynthia truly understood. No one was coming to help. The system had failed them. The world had forgotten them. She was alone with their ghosts. Time is supposed to heal, but for Cynthia Jackson, it was a corrosive acid. The 10 years that followed her brother's disappearance didn't soften the edges of her grief. They sharpened them into a weapon she wielded against a world that had forgotten. While Cleveland changed around her, its industrial heart sputtering and rusting, Cynthia's world remained frozen in the suffocating heat of that August afternoon in 1985. In 1990, 5 years into the long silence, Cynthia was 22, a young woman with old eyes. She walked into the same beige-walled precinct, her jaw set with a grim determination. She carried a thick, 3-ring binder, its pages filled with her own obsessive investigation. Hand-drawn maps of the industrial flats, timelines, newspaper clippings about the slow decline of Superior Meats, and her persistent and proven theory about its owner, Orville Blackwood. She found Detective Miller, now grayer and even more paunchy, on the verge of retirement. He didn't remember her name and only vaguely recalled the case. "The runaway twins," he said, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. Cynthia opened her binder on his desk. "They didn't run away," she said, her voice low and steady. "They were taken. I think he took them." She pointed to Blackwood's name, which she had circled in red ink 100 times. The plant was his kingdom. No one went in or out without him knowing. He was the last person to see them. Miller sighed, a sound of profound bureaucratic weariness. He glanced at her notes with the bored indulgence of an adult listening to a child's ghost story. "Miss," he said, his voice laced with pity, "I know this is hard, but you're chasing shadows. The man's a respected business owner, or was. There was never a shred of evidence. Sometimes there are no easy answers. Kids run. They get into trouble. It's a tragedy, but it's not a conspiracy." He was dismissing her, not as a witness, but as a hysteric, a woman broken by trauma. She left the precinct that day with the cold, heavy realization that her vigil was a solitary one. She was the sole keeper of her brother's memory, a lonely priestess at an altar of forgotten evidence. While Cynthia fought against the fading light, a monstrous reality was unfolding in the dark. Deep in the windowless bowels of the Superior Meats plant, in a soundproofed room hidden from all plans and schematics, time had a different texture. It was measured not in days or years, but in the clank of a steel food tray and the hum of an industrial freezer. Here, Deon Jackson lived in a cage. His world was a 10 by 10 foot steel box. It were a thin cot, a bucket, and a single bare light bulb that was never turned off. The air was cold, sterile, and smelled faintly of bleach. He was no longer a boy. He was 22, but his growth had been stunted, his skin a pale, almost translucent white from the lack of sunlight. He was a specimen. Orville Blackwood's experiment was one of monstrous, disciplined madness. Believing he could perfect the quality of human flesh through absolute environmental control, he had enacted a horrifying plan. Almost immediately after luring the twins inside, he had murdered Dante. The act was swift, passionless, and clinical. Dante became the control group, his remains perfectly preserved in the massive freezer that hummed day and night in the corner of the room. Deon became the variable. He was kept alive, his diet a carefully measured, tasteless gruel designed to purify his system. Blackwood would visit periodically, not to speak, but to observe. He would take notes in a leather-bound ledger, his pale blue eyes studying Deon as a farmer would study prize livestock. He would check his teeth, examine his skin, his gaze clinical and utterly devoid of humanity. For Deon, the worst part was not the hunger or the cold. It was the other cage. Directly opposite his own, identical in every way, sat another steel box. It was empty. It had always been empty. For 10 years, Deon stared at that vacant space, the ghost of his brother a constant, silent presence. He didn't know the precise, horrifying details of Dante's fate, but he knew he was gone. He knew he was alone. And he knew, with the chilling certainty of the damned, that he was being raised for a purpose, that his life was a countdown to a harvest. Outside, the world decayed. The Superior Meats plant officially closed in 1992. A for sale sign went up, rusted, and was eventually swallowed by weeds. The building became just another boarded-up casualty of a dying industry, a hollowed-out skull in a landscape of bones. To the city, it was an eyesore. To Cynthia, it was a tomb. In the autumn of 1995, a condemnation notice was posted on the front gate. The plant was scheduled for demolition. Cynthia stood across the street, the crisp fall air doing nothing to warm the chill in her soul. It felt like the final defeat. Whatever secrets the building held, whatever proof of her brother's fate was locked inside, would soon be reduced to dust and rubble. She had accepted it, the quiet, aching resignation that had become her constant companion. The silence was all that was left. She turned to walk away, a decade of fruitless searching heavy on her shoulders. She didn't know that miles away, a city ordinance had set a ticking clock in motion. She didn't know that the wrecking ball, meant to bury the past, was about to unearth it. The end for the Superior Meats Company plant began not with the roar of a wrecking ball, but with the squeak of a rusted gate. A three-man crew from the city's demolition survey unit arrived on a crisp October morning in 1995. Their job was mundane, a bureaucratic prelude to destruction. Sweep the building for asbestos, lead paint, and unregistered chemical waste. To them, the plant was just another carcass to be picked clean before the bulldozers moved in. The lead inspector, a man named Henderson with 20 years on the job, slid the heavy gate open. The sound was a groan of protest from a long, silent throat. They stepped onto the property, their steel-toed boots crunching on broken glass and desiccated weeds. The air inside the main processing floor was thick with the dust of ages and the faint, ghostly echo of the plant's signature stench. Lights struggled through grime-caked windows, illuminating a cavernous space of silent, hulking machinery. "All right, let's start the sweep from the back," Henderson said, his voice echoing in the vast emptiness. Check the insulation on those old coolant pipes. That's probably where we'll find the asbestos. An hour into their work, Henderson paused, frowning at the rolled-up blueprints in his hand. He was in a labyrinthine basement, a damp, cold space of concrete pillars and dripping pipes. He ran a gloved finger over the schematics. "That's weird," he muttered to one of his crew members, a younger man named Novak. "What's up?" "This wall here," Henderson said, knocking his knuckle against a section of cinder blocks. It gave off a solid, dull thud. According to the original plans from '48, this shouldn't be a wall. This whole section is supposed to be open storage. Looks like it was added later. Much later. His curiosity piqued. He ran his flashlight along the base of the wall. Behind a stack of rusted, forgotten meat lockers, half buried under debris, he saw it. The faint outline of a doorframe. The lockers were heavy, but together, he and Novak managed to heave them aside. They uncovered a heavy, industrial steel door, its surface clean compared to the decay around it. It was secured by not one, but 3 thick, heavy-duty padlocks. They were brassy and new, gleaming in the beam of his flashlight. They didn't belong in a place that had been abandoned for years. "Now what the hell is this?" Novak breathed, his voice a nervous whisper. A cold knot of unease formed in Henderson's stomach. This was no longer a routine survey. This was wrong. "Get the bolt cutters from the truck," he ordered, his voice tight. The snap of the first lock was violently loud in the silence of the basement. The second and third followed. With a shared, nervous glance, Henderson pulled the heavy door open. It swung inward with a low groan, releasing a wave of air that was shockingly different from the rest of the basement. It was cold, dry, and carried an unmistakable smell of antiseptic. It was the air of a hospital, not a derelict factory. They stepped into a narrow, concrete hallway lit by a single, bare bulb. It was clean, disturbingly clean. At the end of the hall was another door, this one even thicker, with soundproofing panels bolted to its surface. There was no lock on this side, only a small, barred window at eye level. Henderson wiped the grime from the window and peered through. What he saw made him recoil, his breath catching in his throat. It was a room, but it was unlike anything he had ever seen. One wall was lined with gleaming stainless steel tables holding a grotesque assortment of butchery tools and what looked like surgical instruments. Another wall was covered in chalkboards filled with meticulous, spidery handwriting and pseudoscientific diagrams. It was a laboratory. It was an abattoir. And in the far corner, his flashlight beam found it. A large steel cage. A flicker of movement from inside. A shape, pale and skeletal, shifted in the darkness. Henderson stumbled back from the door, his heart hammering against his ribs. He heard a sound, faint and choked. A gasp of air that hadn't been used to speak in a very long time. "Jesus Christ," Novak whispered, his face ashen. Henderson fumbled for the radio on his hip, his hand shaking so violently he could barely key the mic. He had thought he was inspecting a building. He now knew he had stumbled into a tomb where one of the dead was still breathing. The lead detective on call was Miles Corbin. "Dispatch, this is Henderson at the Superior Meat site," he stammered, his voice cracking. "You need to get homicide down here. Now. We found something. We found someone. My God, I think he's been in here for years." Detective Miles Corbin moved through the world with a quiet, focused intensity. He was a new breed of cop, a man who trusted data and forensics over gut feelings. But his gut was screaming the moment he stepped into the hidden basement of the Superior Meats plant. The air itself felt wrong, a violation of the natural order of decay. He took in the scene. The inspector's pale faces, the severed locks, the chillingly clean hallway, and knew this was the one. The case that would haunt his sleep for years. "Seal the entire property," he ordered his first uniformed officer on the scene, his voice calm but edged with steel. "No one in or out without my say-so. Get forensics suited up. We treat this entire building as a primary crime scene." He approached the soundproof door, nodding at Henderson, who looked like he'd aged a decade in the last 30 minutes. Corbin peered through the small, barred window, his mind a cold, calculating machine, cataloging the horror within. The lab, the tools, the cage, and the man inside. Corbin took a deep breath and pushed the door open. He entered the room alone first, his presence a stark contrast to the sterile madness of the space. The man in the cage flinched from the sudden intrusion of light and sound, scrambling to the back of the steel box like a terrified animal. He was emaciated, his skin the color of old parchment, his eyes wide and dark in a gaunt face. A tattered blanket was his only clothing. "My name is Detective Corbin," Corbin said, keeping his voice low and even, his hands visible. "I'm with the Cleveland police. We're here to get you out. You're safe now." The man stared at him, his expression a maelstrom of terror and confusion. His throat worked, but only a dry, rasping sound emerged. He looked less like a man of 22 and more like a ghost, an ethereal being tethered to the world by the thinnest of threads. "Can you tell me your name?" Corbin asked gently. The man shook his head, whether in refusal or inability, Corbin couldn't tell. Paramedics were now waiting at the door, ready to move in. But as they prepared to cut the lock on the cage, the man found his voice. It was a hoarse, scraping whisper, the sound of vocal cords long and used. He raised a trembling, skeletal finger and pointed not at the door, not at Corbin, but at a large, humming industrial freezer in the corner of the room. "My brother," he rasped, the two words a monumental effort. Then he added three more that made the blood in Corbin's veins run cold. "He's the control." Corbin didn't understand. Not yet. But the word control, spoken in this grotesque laboratory, sent a chill of profound dread through him. He held up a hand to the paramedics. "Wait." He walked over to the freezer. It was a heavy, commercial-grade unit, sealed tight. He nodded to another officer. "Open it." The officer used a crowbar to pry the heavy, suction-sealed door open. A plume of icy vapor billowed out. The smell was clean, frozen, and utterly devoid of life. Inside, under the stark, unforgiving light of the lab, lay the source of a decade of pain and mystery. It was not a body. It was an inventory. On the metal shelves lay the flash-frozen, butchered remains of a young boy. Each part was meticulously wrapped in plastic, labeled with a small, typed tag bearing a date and a series of cryptic codes. It was an image of such cold, calculated brutality that it defied comprehension. This was not the work of a killer. This was the work of a researcher. On a shelf above the remains sat a single, sealed glass jar. Inside it, preserved in formaldehyde, was a photograph. It was a faded school picture of two identical boys, their arms slung around each other, their faces split by wide, innocent grins. Corbin felt a wave of nausea and fury wash over him. He looked from the smiling boy in the photo to the horrific inventory in the freezer, and then back to the terrified, skeletal man who was now being gently helped from the cage by paramedics. The man who was pointing at the picture, tears streaming down his face, whispering a single name over and over again. "Dante! Dante!" The truth crashed down on Corbin with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't one missing boy. It was two. A control and a variable. A ghost and a survivor. The full, monstrous scope of the decade-long crime was finally revealed in the hum of a freezer and the whisper of a name. He turned away, his face a mask of stone, and keyed his radio. His voice was strained, shaking with a tightly controlled rage. "Dispatch, give me a warrant for the arrest of Orville Blackwood. And find me a woman named Cynthia Jackson. Tell her, God help us, tell her we found her brothers." Orville Blackwood's confession was not a confession. It was a lecture. He sat in the stark, gray interrogation room, an elderly, frail man in a perfectly pressed suit, and he spoke with the chilling, academic pride of a pioneering researcher presenting his life's work. There was no remorse, no guilt, only the profound arrogance of a man who believed himself above all conventional morality. "Murder is such a pedestrian term, Detective Corbin," he said, his pale blue eyes gleaming with intellectual fire. "It implies a messy, emotional act. What I conducted was a study, a longitudinal experiment in environmental influence on genetic equals. The Jackson twins were a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Perfect genetic mirrors. One to act as the baseline, the control, the other to be cultivated, to be perfected. He spoke of Dante's death as a necessary first step, a clinical procedure. He detailed his 10-year cultivation of Deon, the controlled diet, the sensory deprivation, as if he were describing a rare orchid he was growing in a greenhouse. He saw himself not as a monster, but as a visionary, a gourmand of the highest, most forbidden order. His grotesque theories on perfecting the texture and quality of human flesh spilled out of him, a torrent of madness dressed in the language of science. Corbin listened, his stomach churning, realizing he was not interviewing a killer. He was interviewing a void. The reunion between Cynthia and Deon took place in the sterile, white quiet of a hospital room. It was not the reunion she had dreamed of for 10 agonizing years. There were no shouts of joy, no tears of relief. There was only a vast, silent ocean of trauma. Deon, clean and dressed in hospital clothes, looked like a frightened child in a man's body. He flinched at the sunlight, slanting through the window, his eyes darting toward the corners of the room as if expecting the walls to close in. When he saw Cynthia, he recognized her, but the connection was frayed, stretched thin across a decade of unimaginable horror. She wrapped her arms around his frail body, and he was stiff, unresponsive, a man who had forgotten the language of human touch. She had found her brother, but the boy she had lost was gone forever, replaced by this shattered, haunted survivor. The victory of finding him alive was poisoned by the horrifying knowledge of what he had survived and what his twin had not. The legal outcome was a foregone conclusion. Orville Blackwood was imprisoned for life, his monstrous research earning him a place in the annals of criminal infamy. He died in prison a few years later, an old man full of academic pride and no soul. For the world, the case was a shocking headline, a 9-day wonder that eventually faded. For the Jacksons, it was a life sentence. The years that followed were an impossible journey. Deon, the boy who was raised for slaughter, had to learn to live in a world he was never meant to see again. He struggled with agoraphobia, with night terrors, with the ghost of a brother who was both his mirror and his memorial. Cynthia became his anchor. The rage that had sustained her for a decade was transmuted into a fierce, protective love. She quit her job. She dedicated her life to his healing, to shielding him from a world that was too loud, too bright, too full of casual cruelties. She found purpose in her pain, becoming a volunteer, and later a fierce advocate for the families of missing children, her voice given weight by the sheer gravity of her own story. She fought so that no other family would have to endure the silent, lonely vigil she had kept for 10 years. Years later, there's a quiet scene of grace. Deon has a small apartment with a balcony, and on it, he has started to cultivate a garden. It is his only connection to the outside world, a small patch of life he can control. He is still quiet, still scarred, but in the careful way he tends to his tomato plants, there's a flicker of the gentle boy he once was. Cynthia sits with him, watching his hands in the soil. The silence between them is no longer an ocean of trauma, but a quiet harbor of shared understanding. She has one brother back, but she grieves for two. She carries the weight of Deon's survival and the horror of Dante's fate. She looks at her brother, this impossible survivor, then up at the vast, open Cleveland sky. Her fight is over, but her watch never ends. She is the keeper of two stories, the story of the twin who survived and the brother who became a ghost in the cell next door. Steele entombed them, my voice unearthed.